गया नहीं अभी तक?
गाड़ी की सर्विस कब से ड्यू है यार?
ये थोड़ी जाएंगे कहीं, ये तो गाड़ी की सर्विस करवाने के लिए कहीं जाने की जरूरत नहीं है। चिल, कोई गड़बड़ नहीं है। गो मैकेनिक पर पाए एक्सपर्ट कार सर्विसेज, 50 पॉइंट इंस्पेक्शन और 3 महीने की अनकंडीशनल वारंटी। डाउनलोड करें इंडिया का नंबर 1 कार सर्विसेज ऐप गो मैकेनिक।
Go Mechanic.
अरे गया नहीं अभी तक?
गाड़ी की सर्विस कब से ड्यू है यार?
ये थोड़ी जाएंगे कहीं, ये तो गाड़ी की सर्विस करवाने के लिए कहीं जाने की जरूरत नहीं है। चिल, कोई गड़बड़ नहीं है। गो मैकेनिक पर पाए एक्सपर्ट कार सर्विसेज, 50 पॉइंट इंस्पेक्शन और 3 महीने की अनकंडीशनल वारंटी। डाउनलोड करें इंडिया का नंबर 1 कार सर्विसेज ऐप गो मैकेनिक।
Go Mechanic.
Joe Biden, now the 46th president of the United States, has a full plate in front of him.
Afghanistan has been the heart of American military power.
In a clear warning to China, India's military has now taken control of the country for 1 year.
What was happening inside the virology lab in Wuhan?
One ship was able to freeze global trade.
We want love, we want peace, we want equality!
A traditional recipe. It's really very delicious.
It's code red for humanity. The alarm bells are deafening. Wildfires, floods, and hurricanes. Extreme climate events warn of impending doom. Is the world heading towards a climate catastrophe? Watch WION's Climate Tracker weekdays at 12 p.m. GMT, 5:30 p.m. IST.
You don't know how to fix the holes in our ozone layer. You don't know how to bring the salmon back up a dead stream. You don't know how to bring back an animal now extinct. And you can't bring back the forest that once grew where there is now a desert.
You have ignored us in the past and you will ignore us again. We have run out of excuses and we are running out of time.
Show us your faithfulness. Show us your trustworthiness. Show us your honesty. Prove us wrong. We desperately need you to prove us wrong. God help us all if you fail to prove us wrong. God help us.
One trillion species. 7.8 billion humans. 1.9 million species extinct. one planet. Where are we heading? What should we do? Watch Climate Tracker, only on WION. World is One.
Well, thanks for staying with us. You're watching Beyond World is One. My name is Mohammed Saleh, and let's start with the top stories of the day. But the United Nations Security Council is due to vote to call for a rare emergency session of the United Nations General Assembly over the crisis that is unfolding in Ukraine after Russia invaded the country. According to reports that have come in, the Russian troops have reportedly blown up a natural gas pipeline in Kharkiv as the Russian invasion into Ukraine has now continued into its fourth straight day. And a Russian missile hits a southwestern Ukrainian town of Vasikliev, setting oil terminal ablaze. And for the fourth straight night, residents in Kiev spend their nights in underground car parkings and bunkers in order to avoid the fighting and the missile strikes and the artillery shelling that is taking place in Kiev. And Moscow orders its troops to advance into Ukraine from all directions. This after Kiev has imposed a blanket curfew on the capital. And the European Commission President has unveiled a new set of sanctions. She said that Europe and its partners plan to cripple Vladimir Putin's ability to finance his war machine in Ukraine. The European Union is also mulling prohibiting Russian oligarchs from the European financial markets. And New Delhi speeds up its evacuation of the Indian students who had gone to Ukraine to pursue their higher studies and are now stranded because of the war. So far, at least about 3 planes full of Indian students have now taken off from near the war zone, and these students are being brought. to stay indoors.
Ох ты, ёперный банан. Ух.
So this is the latest bit of visuals that have come in from the city of Kharkiv. This, remember, is the second largest city in Ukraine. And according to the information that has come in, this is said to be a deliberate targeting of a gas pipeline by the Russians as a part of their war strategy. This, of course, is being confirmed by the office of the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, who's confirmed that the Russian forces blew up a gas pipeline in the country's second largest city of Kharkiv. And this, of course, has taken place on the 4th day of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. All of this, of course, is happening as a part of a calculated strategy by the Russians, where they've gone about dismantling critical infrastructure in Ukraine. On the first day, we saw the Russians target places such as air bases, the air defense systems, and other crucial infrastructure that Ukraine had that would have helped it to fight back against the Russians. But the Russians went about systematically dismantling the capacity of the Ukrainians to fight back. And now we see that a gas pipeline has been targeted by the Russian forces. This, of course, would be to create a certain level of scarcity in terms of fuel and gas that the people in Ukraine will be able to access from here on. Now, the once vibrant European capital, Kiev, is living in a state of curfew. The residents have been asked to stay off from the streets in the evenings, and Russian forces, according to reports, have also managed to infiltrate into the city. So the Ukrainian authorities have now put in place a very strict curfew that kicks in from 5 p.m. in the evening. And the streets, anyone found loitering on the streets, is now being assumed to be an enemy. So the evening in Kiev, of course, starts with many of these blaring air raid sirens, which are an indicator that missile strikes are imminent. Russian forces have pounded the capital city with artillery and ballistic and cruise missiles. In the dead of the night, the streets have been completely deserted. This is in clear contrast to the columns of vehicles that were seen choking the roads just as soon as war began. So this is what living in a war zone presently looks like, where people are being asked to stay underground.
Все должно быть хорошо. Наши войска справляются.
It's really good atmosphere because it's really very warm people, so close to each other because we help each other.
In the last couple of nights, many have in fact spent their time sheltering in the basements, underground parkings, garages and also metro stations. Ukraine is said to have some of the deepest metro stations in the world. Russia claims that its assault on Ukraine is aimed only at military installations and targets. But reports claim that several common infrastructural aspects such as bridges, schools and even kindergartens and residential buildings have come under attack from the Russians. The Western leaders have urged Vladimir Putin to choose the path of diplomacy. But after Kremlin ordered its troops to barge into the neighboring nation, diplomacy, of course, has taken a bit of a back seat. Kiev has maintained that it is always open for dialogue. But in a statement, the Russian Defense Ministry has claimed that Ukraine has rejected the negotiation process, after which Moscow has ordered to broaden its offensive from all directions.
Вчера, после заявлений киевского режима о готовности к переговорам, активные боевые действия на основных направлениях операции были приостановлены. После того, как украинская сторона отказалась от переговорного процесса, сегодня всем подразделениям был отдан приказ о развитии наступления на всех направлениях в соответствии с планом проведения операции.
In the latest statement by the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, he said that the presidents of Azerbaijan and Turkey have organized for talks with Russia. He's also said that Kiev is ready for talks with Russia.
Ільхам Алієв і президент Ердоган запропонували організувати переговори з Росією. Це можна тільки привітати.
Meanwhile, in the eastern part of Ukraine, especially in Donetsk, there's been intense fighting that has been reported on the front lines of the areas that are controlled by the Russian-backed separatists. Remember, the tensions, in fact, started from here. Russia recognized Donetsk and Luhansk as independent regions. There's been fierce fighting between the national troops and the rebel leaders, and fresh shelling has also taken place, damaging many buildings. At the moment, it is not clear as to how many fell victim to the latest clashes. Meanwhile, down south, a port city that is home to Ukraine's hydroelectric power plant has in fact been taken over by the Russian ground forces. This has been confirmed by satellite imagery that shows Russian trucks on top of the roads along the dam. And experts say the Russian troops have been met with some unexpected resistance in the last 3 days. In 2019, Volodymyr Zelensky was a television personality and a comedian. He was very president who's leading Ukraine's spirited defense against the Russian invading forces. Listening to this unlikely wartime leader.
Боротися стільки, скільки потрібно, щоб звільнити нашу країну. Якщо діти вже народжуються в укриттях, навіть коли тривають постійно обстріли, то у ворога немає жодного шансу у цій, безперечно, народній війні.
From London to New York to Paris to Vienna, thousands of people have in fact taken to the streets to condemn Russia's growing military aggression in Ukraine. Demonstrations have ranged from loud protests to symbolic and subtle ones. Let's start with how people in New York staged a protest. The people gathered at the Times Square to protest Russia's invasion into Ukraine. The demonstrators held up anti-Putin slogans to denounce Moscow of its military maneuvers in Eastern Europe.
We are Ukrainians living in New York, and we are desperate to ask people to help Ukraine to fight, because they are just alone. They're supporting, but actually not supporting. We want real support country, because they are weak. It's a small country. We never wanted war, and we have our relatives, our mothers, children and grandchildren there.
Meanwhile, in London, hundreds of demonstrations rallied outside of the Russian embassy on Saturday to condemn Moscow's military attack. The protesters also chanted pro-Ukraine slogans and waved the Ukrainian flags to express their solidarity with the country. In the former Soviet Republic of Georgia, thousands of protesters hit the streets of the capital city of Tbilisi to support Ukraine as fighting is continued across the country. Georgia, like Ukraine, is also facing a Russia-backed separatist movement. The separatist movement was intensified following a brief war that Russia waged on the tiny nation of Georgia back in 2008. The Moscow-backed forces have since managed to hold on to regions such as South Ossetia and Abkhazia.
I'm here to support Ukraine and their people who are right now fighting a war versus Vladimir Putin and versus Russia. And secondly, I'm going to protest the regime of Vladimir Putin and Russia. I want Ukrainians to know that we are here. All of these people are with them. And Slava Ukraini.
Meanwhile, thousands of protesters marched through Vienna on Saturday to demonstrate against Russia's attacks on Ukraine. The protesters also demanded for an immediate end to Russia's military assault and immediate ceasefire. The demonstration in the Austrian capital coincided with the other shows of solidarity for Ukraine in other European cities like London and Berlin. Meanwhile, in France, hundreds of people took to the streets of Paris to show their support for Ukraine. The demonstrators gathered in the French capital's Republic Square, waving flags and banners. The protests came as Russian troops closed in on Ukraine's capital, Kiev, as a number of skirmishes were reported across the country. Meanwhile, interestingly, in the state of Israel, thousands of protesters also flocked to the Habima Square in central Tel Aviv to condemn the Russian attack. According to reports, about 10,000 protesters joined these protests that were organized by a group called Israeli Friends of Ukraine. It was one of the largest protests that has been witnessed in the state of Israel. And dozens of protesters dressed up in bridal costumes gathered outside of the Russian embassy in Mexico City on Saturday to call out against Putin's military actions. They held up Ukrainian flags and other signs to show their solidarity with the nation. As the conflict rages on in Ukraine, the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi has reportedly also spoken with the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. During the talks, Zelensky, of course, briefed the Indian Prime Minister of the ongoing conflict and the situation in Ukraine. And India's Prime Minister expressed deep anguish about the loss of life and property due to the Russian onslaught and has reiterated India's call for the immediate cessation of hostilities. The Indian Prime Minister also reportedly has urged all parties to return to the diplomatic table and has said that India is in fact willing to contribute in any way towards peace efforts. The Indian Prime Minister also has conveyed some very deep and serious concerns about the safety and security of the Indian students who had gone to Ukraine to pursue their higher studies and who are now stuck in the conflict zone. He sought facilitation by the Ukrainian authorities to expeditiously and to safely evacuate the Indian nationals. And the Ukrainian leader has also tweeted about the talks where Zelensky has called on the Indian political support at the UNSC to, quote-unquote, stop the aggressor. On Thursday, Prime Minister Modi spoke to Russian President Vladimir Putin and also appealed for an immediate cessation of hostilities. He also conveyed that New Delhi attaches the highest priority to the safe return of all Indian nationals who are presently stuck in Ukraine after Russia's invasion into the country. Now, governments across the globe are working round the clock to bring their nationals back from Ukraine. Now, there are some who are coordinating with neighboring embassies to help cross the borders. Now, India, for instance, has launched a pretty big operation to get all Indian nationals who are stranded in Ukraine back. Even as we speak, these are the visuals of these beaming Indian students who have now been evacuated from the war zone. About 240 of them boarded a flight from Budapest and are on the way to the Indira Gandhi International Airport. Now, this, of course, is the third such flight to reach India under Operation Ganga. The second flight from Romania's Bucharest landed in Delhi early in the morning today. 250 nationals were on board that flight. Now, all of these students are, of course, very happy and delighted to be back home in India again. Remember, all of this has happened because of the efforts undertaken by the Indian government to bring back all stranded Indian nationals on priority basis. And the Union Civil Aviation Minister and Minister of State for External Affairs welcomed them at the airport. The first flight carrying Indians evacuated from Ukraine and landed in the financial capital of Mumbai on Saturday evening. They were welcomed by Union Minister, no less than Union Minister Piyush Goyal, who was, of course, waiting for them at the Chhatrapati Shivaji International Airport. Now, the Air India plane, which had taken off from Bucharest, brought home about 219 stranded Indian students who had all gone to Ukraine to pursue their higher studies there. And upon receiving the students at the airport, Piyush Goyal, the Union Minister, said that he was very glad to see the smiles on the faces of Indians who were beaming on getting back to their homeland safely after being evacuated from Ukraine.
The Honorable Prime Minister spoke to the Ukrainian President also and requested him to keep all Indians safe and secure, to provide safe passage to all your colleagues who are still there. And as you go back home...
Now, remember, this, of course, is a mission that has been undertaken by the Indian government. It's called Operation Ganga, and all Indian students stranded in Ukraine are being brought back on a priority basis, with very little difficulty being faced by them. Remember, at least 16,000 Indians are presently stranded and then they got stuck there. New Delhi has urged all nationals to not move to any of the border posts without prior coordination with Indian officials. The latest statement also says that the situation at many checkpoints is extremely sensitive. The Indian government is working very closely with Poland, Slovakia and Romania to ensure safe passage for India's citizens. But according to officials, it is very difficult because of the war to help the nationals cross over the border into another nation. Everyone has been advised to stay calm and to use their limited supplies very judiciously of food, water and medicines. A vaccine certificate or a negative COVID report is mandatory to enter into India, but the government, in the interest of getting all these young students back, has decided to exempt them because they're fleeing from a war in Ukraine. And the decision, of course, has been taken on humanitarian grounds. Now, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has sparked another migrant crisis. According to the United Nations, at least about 5 million Ukrainians are estimated to flee from across the border in Ukraine onto the other side. This is being dubbed as one of the Ukraine's greatest exodus. Tens of thousands of Ukrainians, mostly women and children, have already crossed the border into Poland, Romania and Hungary and Slovakia. But men in the age group of 18 to 60 have been told to stay back and fight for Ukraine. Our next report gets you the details.
Ukrainian women and children fled their country on foot, in cars and by ferry on Friday as Russian missiles pounded the capital, Kiev. Many had to leave behind brothers, husbands and sons under new orders for men aged 18 to 60 to stay and fight.
There is a bombing everywhere and people are afraid and scared. So we want to leave Ukraine right now, but I think that there is no possibility for men to leave. So we need to decide. I have a 5-year-old kid and I have also my sister who has 2 kids. So we are really scared and don't know what will happen here.
Long lines of cars were jammed along the border to Romania, with many waiting for hours to reach the checkpoints.
It's a terrible tragedy and Putin is a crazy person. I have relatives in Russia as well and they are just thinking that it's a not military action, but it's something like saving Russians from someone in Ukraine. So it's really sad how people don't know what's happening.
This ferry service usually takes about 20 cars from Ukraine to Romania per journey, but saw the number tripled as people fled. Tens of thousands of people poured into Romania, Poland, Hungary, and Slovakia on Friday. Authorities in Romania and Poland have lifted pandemic quarantine rules for those arriving from outside the EU, and from Friday, Ukrainians could get COVID-19 vaccinations in Poland. The border congestion was also seen at the Polish town of Medyka. Some already in Poland waited anxiously for loved ones to arrive, like Andriy, who hoped his family would make it soon.
Travel is very hard, of course, a lot of cars, a lot of buses, traffic jam. And then a big price to get here, and I hope 2, maybe 3 hours and they will come here. I think I will cry.
UN aid agencies say the war could drive up to 5 million people to flee abroad, with up to 3 million heading to Poland alone.
Well, that's all the time we have in this edition of the News Bulletin. Stay tuned to WION.
India's Global Voice, the channel that brings you the biggest stories from across the world through India's.
अरे गया नहीं अभी तक? गाड़ी की सर्विस कब से ड्यू है यार?
ये थोड़ी जाएंगे कहीं, ये तो गाड़ी की सर्विस करवाने के लिए कहीं जाने की जरूरत नहीं है। चिल, कोई गड़बड़ नहीं है। गो मैकेनिक पर पाए एक्सपर्ट कार सर्विसेज, 50 पॉइंट इंस्पेक्शन और 3 महीने की अनकंडीशनल वारंटी। डाउनलोड करें इंडिया का नंबर 1 कार सर्विसेज ऐप गो मैकेनिक।
Go mechanic.
अरे गया नहीं अभी तक? गाड़ी की सर्विस कब से ड्यू है यार?
ये थोड़ी जाएंगे कहीं, ये तो गाड़ी की सर्विस करवाने के लिए कहीं जाने की जरूरत नहीं है। चिल, कोई गड़बड़ नहीं है। गो मैकेनिक पर पाए एक्सपर्ट कार सर्विसेज, 50 पॉइंट इंस्पेक्शन और 3 महीने की अनकंडीशनल वारंटी। डाउनलोड करें इंडिया का नंबर 1 कार सर्विसेज ऐप गो मैकेनिक।
Go mechanic.
Joe Biden, now the 46th president of the United States, has a full plate in front of him.
Afghanistan has been the heart of American military power.
In a clear warning to China, India's military has now taken control of the country for 1 year.
It says that it's likely to miss by around.
What was happening inside the virology lab in Wuhan?
One ship was able to freeze global trade.
We want love, we want peace, we want equality!
There are
a traditional recipe, and it's really very delicious.
It's code red for humanity. The alarm bells are deafening. Wildfires, floods, and hurricanes. Extreme climate events warn of impending doom. Is the world heading towards a climate catastrophe? Watch WION's Climate Tracker weekdays at 12 p.m. GMT, 5:30 p.m. IST.
You don't know how to fix the holes in our ozone layer. You don't know how to bring the salmon back up a dead stream. You don't know how to bring back an animal now extinct. And you can't bring back the forest that once grew where there is now a desert.
You have ignored us in the past and you will ignore us again. We have run out of excuses and we are running out of time.
Show us your faithfulness. Show us your trustworthiness. Show us your honesty. Prove us wrong. We desperately need you to prove us wrong. God help us all if you fail to prove us wrong. God help us.
Welcome back to WION World is One. My name is Hem Kaur Saroya. We continue our coverage of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, starting with the headlines now. United Nations Security Council due to vote for a rare emergency session of the UN General Assembly.
Ох ты, ёперный банан.
Russian troops blow up natural gas pipeline in Kharkiv as Russian invasion of Ukraine continues for the fourth day. Russian missile hits southwest a Ukrainian town of Kharkiv, setting oil terminal ablaze. Kiev residents take shelter in makeshift beds in an underground car parking as curfew continues. Moscow orders its troops to advance in Ukraine from all directions. This after Kiev imposes a blanket curfew on the capital. European Commission President unveils new sanctions, says Europe and partners plan to cripple Putin's ability to finance his war machine. EU mulls prohibiting Russian oligarchs from European financial markets. New Delhi speeds up evacuation from war-torn Ukraine as third flight from Budapest taken off for Delhi with 240 Indian nationals. In an attempt to counter Russian troops in Ukraine, U.S. President Joe Biden has now signed an order to provide $350 million in military aid to Kiev. The development comes as Russian forces continue to march forward to siege the Ukrainian capital and overturn the Zelensky government. Other countries, including Germany, have also announced to provide military assistance to Kiev, while France has pledged to send more military equipment as well as fuel to Ukraine to help fight off the Russian invasion here. Our next report gets you all the details.
President Joe Biden on Friday instructed the U.S. State Department to release up to an additional $350 million worth of weapons from U.S. stocks to Ukraine as the country struggles to push back a Russian invasion. In a memorandum to Secretary of State Antony Blinken, Biden directed that $350 million allocated through the Foreign Assistance Act be designated for Ukraine's defense. This marks the third time that the United States has drawn from its weapons to supply Ukraine, after doing so in the fall of 2021 and then again in December. Blinken on Saturday called the third authorization unprecedented. Over the past year, the United States has committed more than $1 billion to security assistance to Ukraine, Blinken said. Ukraine has been asking for Javelin anti-tank weapons and Stinger missiles to shoot down aircraft. Other nations have pledged military material to Kyiv as Ukraine's military fights against an invading Russian force. The Netherlands will supply 200 Stinger air defense rockets, while Belgium has pledged 2,000 machine guns and 3,800 tons of fuel. France has decided to send defensive military equipment, while adding that the issue of sending offensive arms was still under consideration.
And for more on this, Dr. Malcolm R. Davis, Senior Analyst in Defence Strategy and Capability, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, Canberra, is now joining us live. Thank you so much for joining us. Citizens of Ukraine have taken up arms. Russian forces continue to pound the capital with artillery and cruise missiles. How do you assess the strategic and military capabilities of Ukraine to hold off Russian forces? U.S. President Joe Biden, as you know, has also approved more military aid for Ukraine.
Well, look, I think what you're seeing is the Ukrainians actually doing a rather good job, or more to the point, the Russians doing a rather poor job in terms of undertaking this invasion. The Russians have failed to gain air superiority, which I think is absolutely amazing that hasn't happened. And they've taken heavy losses in their advance from the north. Also, logistically, their operation is all over the place. There's tanks and armoured fighting vehicles running out of fuel on the road. So logistically, they're poorly supported. So clearly, I would argue that at least from the north, the Russian offensive seems to be bogging down. It's not achieving its goals. It's taking heavy casualties. And this is an embarrassment for, obviously, President Putin and for the Russian military.
All right. And this, as you know, has triggered a refugee crisis. This war threatens to displace millions more. What are your views on this?
Yeah, the refugee issue is a very serious one. You're going to have large numbers of civilians coming out of Ukraine into Poland, and I think the Poles are probably managing that as best they can. But those people have to be protected. And it's interesting to note that a lot of Ukrainian families are basically heading west to NATO states, and then mostly the men, the males of that family are heading back to fight. So I think that your refugee crisis is going to grow over time, particularly if the Russians start to escalate their offensive against the cities, including Kyiv. Potential for large-scale civilian casualties weighs heavily on everyone's mind. And so I think you will see increasing numbers of refugees heading westwards.
Right. Also now, Russia's military operations started in East. They're swiftly moving in deeper in Ukraine. What are your views on the Russian plan of action? What can we expect in the days to come?
I think given the poor showing so far by the Russian military means that Putin and his regime will place increasing pressure on the Russian military to actually make gains. So you could see increasing use of large-scale, high explosive weapon systems. One of those ones that I think we have to be aware of is the TOS M1, which is a thermobaric weapon system that has been deployed into Ukraine. It's the closest thing to a nuclear weapon without actually having a nuclear weapon. You could see that being used on Ukrainian forces as potentially as well as Ukrainian cities, and that would cause horrendous civilian casualties. The other issue that the Russians are going to try and do is finally gain control of the air, and so you will see increasing numbers of air and missile strikes on key targets around Ukraine, designed to be able to not only knock out airfields, but also take out the command and control systems. So those two goals of advancing more effectively into the cities and taking control of the air, I think, will be the focus for Russian military forces going forward.
All right. Dr. Davis, thanks so much for joining us with all your inputs on this.
Thank you.
Moving on, as Russian troops continue to unleash their assault on Kiev and other Ukrainian cities, the West is ramping up measures to impose more sanctions on Russia, particularly targeting its economy. In the latest, Western allies have now agreed on a new list of financial sanctions against Moscow. European Union has proposed banishing a number of Russian banks from the SWIFT interbank system. With this, West will ensure that these Russian banks are disconnected from the international financial system. The allies have also agreed to impose restrictive measures to prevent the Russian central bank from deploying its international reserves. Adding on to this, affluent Russians connected to Putin's government will also no longer be allowed to use the golden passport system to obtain a European citizenship. Speaking in Brussels, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, EU and other Western powers, including the United States and UK, are considering the move to cripple Vladimir Putin's war machine.
As Russian forces unleash their assault on Kiev and other Ukrainian cities, we are resolved to continue imposing massive costs on Russia. Costs that will further isolate Russia from the international financial system and our economies. In coordination with President Biden, President Macron, Bundeskanzler Scholz and Prime Minister Draghi, as well as Prime Minister Trudeau and Prime Minister Johnson, we considered a significant tightening of our international response. The European Union and its partners are working to cripple Putin's ability to finance his war machine.
Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov, meanwhile, has said that Moscow is taking up immediate measures to mitigate the damage from the West-imposed sanctions. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, meanwhile, has welcomed the move to disconnect Russia from the global financial system.
І натхненно за те, щоб усі країни Європи погодили дуже сильне і справедливе рішення відключити Росію від міжнародної міжбанківської мережі. Маємо і цю важливу перемогу. Це мільярди і мільярди збитків для Росії. Конкретна ціна за це підле вторгнення в нашу державу.
Zelensky has also asked UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres to strip Russia of its vote at the UN Security Council as punishment for invading Ukraine. This comes a day after Russia used its veto power against a UN Security Council draft resolution that sought to condemn its invasion of Ukraine. Increasing proxy wars in the recent years have set a trend in rising forced displacement. The number stands at a whopping 84 million worldwide, and the invasion of Ukraine is only going to make it worse. Ukraine's location on the globe is a big reason for its vulnerable state. The western border is the only flank which does not share a boundary with Russia or its allies. So naturally, innocent civilians are fleeing towards the European Union borders. Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania are the UN refugee body says that since the last 3 days of the invasion, 150,000 Ukrainians have crossed into neighboring countries. Let's just get you some visuals from a Polish border city where fearful families throng to evade shelling. Among the people fleeing Ukraine, at least half are going to Poland. The government has reserved 70,000 hospital beds for those who are wounded and has prepared a train to transport the injured from Ukraine. More train wagons have also been loaded with humanitarian supplies for the Lviv region. Moving on to Slovakia, where charity workers and locals are helping incoming Ukrainian refugees. Over the past 24 hours, 10,500 people have entered from the Slovak-Ukraine border. The governor of the eastern region said that the situation was getting worse by the hour.
Tá situácia sa každou hodinou ako keby zhoršovala, čo sa týka počtu ľudí. Postupne začína tá štruktúra tých utečencov, vlastne vojnových utečencov, meniť na ľudí, ktorí sú bez auta, bez finančných prostriedkov, bez jedla, bez vybavenia. Navyše tie rodiny rozdeľujú na ukrajinskej strane, to znamená, že mužov vracajú naspäť na Ukrajinu vlastne do boja.
Now, some were forced to walk many kilometers through the night, while others flew by. Few of the refugees were greeted by waiting relatives and friends. Others headed on to their own homeless centers.
They come into our country.
Russia's invasion into Ukraine has divided the world. The United States and its allies in the West have tried to project a united front against Russian aggression. But Russia, too, has mustered its allies. Let's take a look at who has backed the war, who has condemned it, and who has remained neutral during Europe's worst crisis since World War II. Let's start with the US-sponsored draft resolution at the UNSC. The draft sought to deplore in the strongest terms Russia's aggression against Ukraine. The draft resolution was bound to fail. Russia, as a permanent member, vetoed the draft. China, India, and the United Arab Emirates abstained.